Kia ora, talofa lava, malo elele, ulavanaka, kia orana, warm Pacific greetings. My name is David Toombs. I'm the Howard Patterson Professor of Theology and Public Issues here at the University of Otago. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Zoom public lecture, which is the first in a series of 3 on Moana Theology, which we're delighted to be hosting over the next few weeks. Next week, Tuesday, 16th of November, we'll be hearing from Professor Mosise Meilu, Principal of Moana Theological College, at the slightly earlier time of 6 p.m. And we'll be sending details of that out tomorrow. Then on 23rd November, our speaker will be Dr. Mercy Arsiu Maliku, a research affiliate here at the Centre of Theology and Public Issues at Otago, and also a lecturer at National University of Samoa. For this evening, our distinguished speaker is Dr. Jione Havea, a research affiliate at, a Methodist pastor from Tonga, and a research fellow with Trinity Methodist Theological College, Aotearoa, and with the Public and Contextual Theology Research Centre of Charles Sturt University, Australia. He's the author or editor of numerous books, including Losing Ground, Reading Ruth in the Pacific, Theologies from the Pacific. Jione will be speaking on Going Native, reading Ruth in and for the Pacific. We're planning to record the lecture, so please keep your microphones off and avoid the chat while Jione is speaking, and then reactivate them for the Q&A. I'll reactivate them for you. Before we start, though, let me pass over to Reverend Latu to open our evening with prayer. Latu, over to you.
Malofa everyone. Thank you, Professor David Toombs. Given that this is the first lecture, Zoom lecture for Moana Theology, let me pray in our tongue. Tātou te talo whawhtai rea tua ne whiawhi mau lea wanoe wheloa iai, ia I mātou uma, vi ia lo wang le lei whi au mga ruenga o tiute mwhaiva mawala wina. Ia fo I le vi inga ia te oe, tui nā tūte whaasore ni whiawhi lau auna ia Jione Havea, ia whaasore mai so sia mai ta mau a inga o mawhau whaunga o le uta ma le moe, ia wala wala tāpe na ina ma le whau wina o mātou tangata, ia au ngai te whi au ma le ngā ruenga mātou whaasore, ia fo I le vi inga ia te oe. Fiu fi mātou rautotu, I mātou lava o tangata se whamangar, stua for Yesu, o le mawala au atoai, and everyone says, Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Latu. And over to you, Jione. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Malo Latu, malo David. Korege ufanga ye ngai whatapu to be wa whaki, kai atake whaegi whahauha goeni ye whiawhini. I'm zooming across from the Wurundjeri Wurrung clan's land and the Waiwurrung language, and I appreciate the starting with Moana Samoa in our prayer this evening. So Wurundjeri is in the edge of Te Moana Nui a Kiwa and Te Moana Atea. It's in the meeting point of these great moana. When we do our respect, we pay our respect and our recognition in Tongan, especially when you do it orally, we end by saying, asking for permission. Ke whakahohaa, whakahohaa. Whakahohaa, the root for whakahohaa is hohaa and hoha, hohaa. So it is about disturbance. So I pay my respect to you, Kaumatua, and everyone who's listening in, and ask for your permission to let me disturb you for a few minutes this evening. And I want to add to my hoha'a, 3 apologies. First, I apologize, but this is not a lecture in the Western traditional academic sense. This is Talanoa. And for those of you who are not familiar with the language, actually Fijian and Samoans claim that Talanoa is one of their words. but I think it's more a Tuvaluan word. Talanoa has three connotations. It means story. I have talanoa, I have story to tell. When I tell, the act of telling the story is talanoa, and conversation. When conversation about the story or the telling is also talanoa. And my aim is to stop in about 30 minutes time. And if I don't stop, somebody just mute me so that we can have a conversation so that the talanoa can continue. My second apology is that most of my going native advocacy has been through publications. And I've asked David if he can provide the link to one of my recent going native attempts. Is in an article that just came out earlier this year. And Brian will put the link to the Bible and Cultural Studies, Bible and Critical Theory e-journal that will have another piece that comes out in about 2 weeks' time on this thing that I call going native. So I'm saying that I do most of my going native through publication so that you can point out how ridiculous that is. That I try to go native by writing, which is not a native way of doing things. And this is my way also of thanking David and Latu and the Otago community for this opportunity to go native in Talanoa mode. And Talanoa, as most of you know, when we Pasifika folk get into Talanoa, we don't really keep an eye on time. So time is fluid when we are in Talanoa. My third apology is that going native is not something that is unique to me. A lot of other people do this going native, but we have different names for them. Tuyatua, for example, the most respected of our, in our Moana Kiwa, of Samoan heritage, but he is a citizen of Moana Nui. Tuyatua calls it the indigenous reference points that we all need to go to. And Mosese, who will be speaking next week, Mailo has been using Tuyatua. Upolu in theology, biblical studies, we have Dr. Brian. I mean, this is just our way of saying that Brian has graduated thanks to the University of Divinity. We all use Tuyatua, and including myself as a Tongan, and there are others. So my going native is not, I don't want to claim it as something that's unique to me, but to simply say that this is something that we all do as Moana people or Pasifika people. It's just that we need to have an opportunity to come together and share our waka, share our fale, and be able to work together towards this thing that I call native, going native, or reading with native, in the interest of native people. So this is not a lecture, it's more a talanoa, and I'm gonna take advantage of technology and speak to a PowerPoint. And if it works, it will work. So talanoa. There are two parts to this talanoa. The first is I'm going to try to explain what native means. Native is a term that there are a lot of people find troubling because it connotes people who are savages, according to the missionaries and the anthropologists, pagans and uncivilized. And I'll explain this a little more when I get to that part of this talanoa. But I want to say that going native is something that needs to be done for two main reasons for me. One is because a lot of our people are ashamed to affirm their, what I would call nativeness, whether they are Samoan or Fijian or Tongan or Tuvaluan. We are ashamed. And I have examples from the theological circles. I was once, Brian told me that I should just tell jokes for 1 hour, but I don't have too many jokes, so I'm going to just tell some stories. And they are insulting. So, joking in native tongue tends to insult others. So here's my first talanoa. I was asked to mark a thesis at PTC, Pacific Theological College in Suva. And the writer of the thesis, I'm now out him a little bit. His first name was very Western. His family name was also Western. And through the thesis, and part of my assessment was to say that if this thesis was submitted in an institution, a Dutch institution or a German institution, the people who read it would not have any idea that this was a native of the Moana Nui Akiwa, that he was a native. His name suggests that he's Western. His writing was really clear, and he wrote like an English person, let me put it that way. But for me, this is the legacy of theological education in our waters. We are afraid, even ashamed, to be natives. And the irony, of course, is that PTC was created to be a platform for engaging our Moana context. The thesis therefore passed the European academic standards, but failed the native Moana wisdom objectives which we need to affirm. My second talanoa of why we need to go native is another thesis at PTC. The student, a man also, a Tongan student. The dean at PTC at that time was a Tongan. I am a Tongan. So I wrote my assessment in Tongan. The Tongan dean, wrote back to me and said, if I could provide a translation of my assessment so that for the PTC records. And my response was very sharp, simply that the Tongan language is a theological and an academic language. So if you do not recognize and honor the Tongan language, then you and PTC do not belong in Oceania. Simply. There are Tongans who can assess Tongan thesis. There are Fiji and Samoans. There are Tuvaluans who can assess the thesis presented in our native language. As Latu started us with, calling attention to our native language. But so why do we have to write in English? Why do we have to write in German and French in the Pacific, but not in Samoan, Fijian, and the other languages, the so-called vernacular languages? So we need to go native in order to bring up not just the interests of our people, but also our language as well. You may ask, is this possible? And my simple answer to that is, yes, it is. And it has been done. If you think back, I think back 20 years ago, how we were ashamed to be identified as Forbes, fresh off the boat, Forbes. That had to do with the legacy of the Dawn raid in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and for those of us who became migrants to Australia and other places. We were ashamed to call ourselves Forbes. But nowadays, it's the proudest thing among young people who are growing up in Australia and New Zealand to be known as Forbes. There's even a thesis at PTC on Forbes hermeneutics by someone from Piula, Titimaya. So if Forbes can be transformed so that we can be proud of being Forbes, then I'm suggesting that we can also transform and affirm native. And I'm using native as the umbrella term for me as a Tongan, for you as Fijian, Tongan, or Samoan, or any. There are so many diverse communities in our islands, in our region, and I'm using native as an umbrella for all of us in our different situations. So that is the first part of my talanoa, is to present what native means. The second part is to apply what going native means into a reading of the Ruth narrative. And I'll be sharing 4 observations, 4 learnings that I picked up from several of the Pasifika communities. When I worked on this text, Losing Ground, Reading Ruth in the Pacific, the research for this book was done on the community. In 2018 and 2019, I went around the islands and did Bible studies on Ruth. And the readings and observations by the people in those communities helped me write Bible studies on the text. And I will share 4 of those, of the insights that I learned from the native people. So this was not a book written in a library. This book was written in the community, in engagement with the community, and the people teaching me their languages in Solomon Islands, in Nauru, in Tonga, in Aotearoa, in other places in Ma'ohinui. I wasn't able to go to Samoa. I think there's something, the Samoans have issues with the Tongan Methodists coming to do Bible studies there. So they didn't let me, or at least they didn't encourage me to come there. But I also did it in response to climate change, to the effects of climate change. And that is the reason for that cover that you have there. I'm hoping Brian will put the link on the chat. And I want to call your attention to this other work, Reading Ruth in Asia. So Reading Ruth in the Pacific and Reading Ruth in Asia are 2 works that are, and Brian, if you also put the link for that, that is at the background of what I will be presenting in this Talanoa. Reading Ruth in Asia, you can download in a PDF version. And you probably, yes, I'll just leave it that and come back another time. So when I say native, who are the natives that I have in mind I'm referring to? When people talk about natives, they think of savages. This is what the missionary had told us about our ancestors. And this particular work is the LMS missionary James Chalmers raising his fist against those greedy natives who come with spears. And this is how our people are remembered in the archives of missionary societies. And you can immediately, I hope you can see the irony that it's actually the other way around. They are the people who came with the weapons and the guns and the swords, not with their bare arms, and we are the ones who got massacred. So the question is, who are the real savages? When we are talking about, when I'm speaking of natives, I am thinking in terms of these savages, and we need to reclaim, reaffirm the savages which are our ancestors. When I'm speaking of native, I'm also thinking of people who have become noble savages, that is, natives who affirm or who propagate the missionary agenda and who buy in to the colonial project. And that is part of what going native is about. It's about correcting what the missionaries had, how the missionaries had portrayed the savages, our people, and engage with how and expose some of the radical elements in those whom they present as noble savages. So that's the second aspect. And third is what I call a native pastor. And this is my self-designation. I call myself a native pastor. And throughout my work, I identify myself as both native and pastor. And that's mainly because in the academy, they look down on natives. They don't think that natives can think. And they look down on pastors, that pastors can't think critically. So Since the beginning of my career, I've always referred to myself as a native pastor, just to show those academic folk that some indigenous people, some natives can think, and some pastors can think critically. But I have a model, and pardon this is a bit of a personal story. This is the image of the native, a model of a native pastor. So, and as you can see, his name is spelled with a J. That's why my name is spelled with a J and not like the normal Jione in Tonga and Samoa, whose names are spelled with S. He was born in 1869. In the 1880s in Tonga, Taufa Ahau, who became our first king, he became king in 1845. Taufa Ahau in the 1880s led what historians call a civil war to unify the group under Christianity. A civil war for the purpose of unifying the Tongan people under Christianity. James Moulton, on the other hand, called it religious persecution. And there are two reasons that I agree with Moulton. First, in 1887, the king of Tonga, the first king of Tonga, Christian king of Tonga, endorsed an exile that took people who were Methodists from Tonga to the island of Koro in Fiji, an exile, which included his own daughter. And I think if it was a son, he would not have done that. And a young girl who became the second wife of this native pastor that I'm named after. So in 1887, the king went around the island trying to get people to buy into his project of unification and becoming Christian. So this young man at age 18 refused to join the king's movement. Because of that, he was charged, sentenced, and fined 3 shillings. In 1887, 3 shillings is a lot of money in Tonga. 8 days of imprisonment and 7 lashes, 70 lashes for not joining the king's movement. Yet he said, no, I'm not going to be part of your movement, you might call it Kingitanga, if your movement to unify the people. So for me, when I say I'm a native pastor, it's about characters like this, is being someone who has the courage to push back at authorities, including the king of the land. This pastor learned and became a tutor at Tupo College, one of the colleges in Tonga. And at that time, the king sent for him and 2 other leaders to come and join his church and his movement. And he still said, no, I don't want to be a part of your movement. For me, that's what it means to be a native. It includes having the courage to say no to the authorities of the land. He died in 1942, having become the head tutor of the college. And when he died, the former principal, Kolokoti, Edgar Kolokoti, paid tribute to him. And this is part of his tribute. Perhaps greatest of all the debts I owe to Jione Havea was the cleansing of my mind from any lingering vestiges of ideas of racial superiority. Kolokoti was a British Australian. And this native pastor cleansed his mind, or he claims that the native pastor cleansed his mind from any lingering vestiges of ideas of racial superiority. There were others, but daily contact with Jione Havea made any notions of white superiority absurd. For me, this is what is involved when you become a native pastor. You push back at the authorities of the land, as well as any missionaries who might think that they are superior than our people. That's what going native involves. And that's what I will try to do in showing, press the wrong button, 1 second, in showing the readings of Ruth. I'm gonna stop share and share again so that I'm sure that I have the sound. Because what I will do now is to share a clip that gives you the authorized, oops, I didn't check. Let me try that again. We'll provide a version, yes, it should work, of Ruth, just to remind you of what the narrative is. I will only play 5 minutes of this clip to give you an idea of this narrative. So here we go.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of
So that's gives you an overview of the narrative. I'm going to quickly go over the 4 elements that I learned from the Pasifika communities. In the eyes of biblical Israel and of pro-Israel readers, Moab represents the savages. They are the savages that an equivalent of the savages that I had referred to earlier. And this had to do with the story of Lot and his 2 daughters. And this is Reuben's depiction of Lot, and Reubens have matched the fantasy of many old men to be as masculine as Lot in their old age. But I'm guessing I hope you remember the story. It's the incestuous relations between Lot and his 2 daughters that led to the Moabites and the Ammonites. And they are, in the eyes of the Bible, considered to be God-forsaken. Now, the communities that I did the Bible studies with did not see the Moabites as God-forsaken. They look at the story and notice, for example, that it started with a famine in Bethlehem. And there's part of the irony, because Bethlehem is house of bread. Famine in Bethlehem, Judah, and the family went to Moab. And Moab is a house of food and refuge. So for the Pasifika communities that are the natives, let me use that label, there's nothing wrong with Moab. Moab was a good place to go to. They were surprised also when I said that Ruth is called a Moabite throughout the narrative, and most readers think that that is a negative designation. For the natives, on the other hand, they need to be proud of being, they saw Ruth as a good character because she comes from Moab, the house of food, the house of refuge. So what does going native involves in reading narratives like Ruth? It is about restoring, retelling, reaffirming Moab, Judah, Bethlehem, all the characters. And that's what the native communities helped me do in that book, from which I'm drawing these readings. So that's the Moabite. I just saw that time is passing, so I'll move quickly. Traditional reading saw Orpah deserting or betraying Naomi, walking away, as you can see in this woodcut. Whereas Ruth is the noble savage. Orpah is the native savage who walks away. Ruth helps. And this is something interesting in this woodcut, because in the 2 women, you can't quite tell which one is Naomi and which one is Ruth. They look both young, whereas Orpah looks like that old woman with the cane walking away. But the traditional readers invite us to read the story by looking through Naomi and Ruth and letting Orpah walk away. Here's another version. This is where Ruth is clinging, whereas Orpah is the one who is ready to walk away. And you can see the queer element in this particular image. And there is the issue of consent, because with the right hand, you think there is consent, but the left hand seems to be pushing away. So these are things that the native readers had engaged with and offer their alternative reading. And the most important thing that I learned from these communities was that they did not want Orpah to leave the story. She left the story and readers let her exit, but the natives did not want her to exit. So the whole my collection of Bible studies was in part through the perspectives of Orpah. Here's one from Asia, who choose Ruth and Naomi. You can see Ruth and Naomi here, and the woman on the background is Orpah, and the posture of dissatisfaction or annoyance with her hand to her head. The Solomon Islanders, this is not a very Western drawing. It made the book actually. And this posture of having your hand at the back of your head in the Solomon Islands is a sign of disappointment. The learning for me here is that this group, when we did the Bible study, this group wanted Ruth to come towards the viewer. This group wanted Orpah to come towards the viewer and to see Ruth and Naomi walking away from Orpah. Now, for me, that is a very powerful native reading. Another group in the Solomon Islands did not think that Orpah was crying. On the other hand, it is Orpah was walking away with her thumbs up, finally get her freedom to walk away from Orpah, from Naomi and Ruth. And at the same time, Naomi and Ruth were enjoying themselves, having their freedom from Orpah. It's not whether Orpah was disappointed or whether she was happy. It's the invitation in these two drawings for us to see Orpah and not let her walk away as we see in the other artworks. This particular drawing was done in Fiji, in a group Bible study in Fiji. The three girls, so is the three greedy girls is the title. And this woman is Naomi. And the group was very clear that this woman is an European. Naomi is a European, not a Fijian, whether it's of Itauke or Indian heritage. And the chest of wealth at the back, it represents Moab. And Naomi was walking away with a bag of money, and she was pushing away people or whoever is in her way. Clinging to her, and this smooth arm is Ruth. That was holding on to Naomi. And on the other hand, at the left corner, you see a rugged old hand. And for this group, this is the hand of Orpah. And this, again, is an invitation for us to look at what's happening through the perspective, with, as well as through the perspective of Orpah. So what does it mean to go native on a narrative like this? We need to identify and see through the perspectives of those people who are rejected, those people that the narrative leaves, on the roadside. Looking at Ruth, I'll tell you this story. I mean, Gisborne, I did Bible study with two groups. One was the Maori group, and the other one was Tongan migrants. And it was a part about the threshing floor, and part of my anxiety was, how do you ask a group of women, older women who were older than me, how do you ask them if Ruth had sex with Boaz in the threshing floor in chapter 3? And I was trying to find the words. One of the old women said, "Oh, get over it. That kind of thing happens in the Wharenui, so don't worry about it. People have sex. So what's your anxiety?" And I put Sia's work there because I think it's us men who have anxiety about this sex issue. For them, for the natives, it's not whether they had sex, it's how many people had sex and where did they have sex. So they shifted the Maori group in Gisborne. They shifted. It's not just on the road where Ruth said, "Where you go, I will go, and where you die, I will die," and so forth. It's also in the field, because when Ruth came back with the food from Boaz, Naomi said, "Oh, where have you been?" And she said, "Oh, I went to this place, and it happens to be Boaz." And then Naomi said, oh, that's a good guy because he's a relative of ours. And then Ruth rubbed it in. She said, oh, he told me that I should hang out with the young men. And Boaz, I'm sorry, and Naomi told Ruth, you shouldn't go with the young men, you should go with the young women. So the Maori group, for them, there are two readings. The traditional reading, it's for her safety. If you go with the men, you might get abused. And therefore, you should go with the women. The second reading that they challenged me with was the possibility that Naomi knew that Ruth likes women more than men. And for them then, the issue was on how Naomi and Ruth was already a couple. There was no anxiety about that, but how Boaz joined the couple, and that became a family of choice. Now, the family of choice, according to Mona West, is where people serve the function, the typical role of family in the support system. Doesn't matter if you're a father, a man or a woman, you can be a mother, you can serve the function of a mother or the function of a father, no matter what your biological sex is. So that's the family of choice that these natives help me see. I'll come back to that if there are questions, but this was all sealed by the village women, according to the Maori group, because at the end, the women of the neighborhood gave him, the child, a name saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So what the women did was to make this child have two mummies, the mummy that gave birth to him, as well as the other mummy that they had assigned. So it became a family of three, with Naomi, with Ruth, and with Boaz when he joined them. The other interesting thing from the Nauru group was how at the end of the story, before the story ends, Ruth disappears from the narrative. And their question was, where did she go? Did she go back to Moab? Did she go back looking for Orpah? And if she found Orpah, what did they talk about? What was their talanoa? So the series of Bible studies I did was about how Orpah didn't leave the story and how Orpah may have been sought out by Ruth before the story ended. I'm going to move on to the final element, the politics of Pohoko. Pohoko is our word in Tonga, whakapapa for te reo, and I'm not Maori, so I'll just leave whakapapa there, but I want to highlight two differences. Pohoko is about linking, and whenever you link, there is also always the opportunity to unlink. Same thing in papa, in layering, you layer and you delayer at the same time. In Tonga, there are two times when hohoko is important. When you look to establish or when you look to challenge the rights of inheritance. And you find this in this narrative as well, because when the women gave the son to Naomi, they named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So in the hohoko of the women, Obed was the son of Naomi. When the official hohoko came, they reclaimed, they stole Obed from Naomi and gave him to Obed. So there is the politics of hohoko, for papa, is where the narrative steals the right of inheritance from one and give it to the other. My time is up, but I want to quickly identify that going native and reading biblical texts involves at least these four things. It involves restoring the God-forsaken, involves seeing the outcast or seeing with the outcast, involves opening the master's house, opening up this heteronormative house so that it can be a family of choice, and involves picking the hoko or the papa. And I use picking both as in choosing or attending to, as well as when you pick a lock, when you break into that house. So I will stop there, and I apologize, it's been a long talanoa, but I want to give some time for comments or questions. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jione. That was absolutely wonderful. You've explored with us a really rich and fascinating range of Bible studies. I'm going to stop the recording and